Hello everyone, you're watching the developer of the Shadow of Chernobyl update project, and in this video I'll briefly touch on the publicly available version of the mod, talk about the current progress on version 2.0, and show some of the new work that has been done. Throughout the video, I'll be discussing several gameplay mechanics that may be controversial for some players. I'll also be leaving a few open questions along the way. Because of that, I'd like to ask everyone to pay close attention and, in the end, share your thoughts in the comments regarding each of those questions. This project is made for players, and it has never been aimed at one specific audience. That's why version 2 will offer a fairly diverse gameplay experience, new features, different mechanics, and difficulty levels that are balanced in different ways. However, in order to fine-tune everything properly, I really need your support, specifically, your feedback on the features that are either already implemented or currently in active development. Yes, this video will focus exclusively on what is already done or still in progress. That has always been my approach in development update videos, and nothing has changed in that regard. I don't want to talk about distant plans or make promises, only to show what already exists, with the introduction out of the way. Before we move on to the development news, I'd like to wish everyone a happy new year. In the new year, I wish you all good health, strength, and endless motivation to bring your personal ideas to life. But most importantly, peace and kindness, mutual understanding with those around you, and new friendships. I'd also like to add a few words from Kirill: health to everyone, and warmth in the embrace of your loved ones. And may all the dirt, gloom, and muddy mood of 2025 stay in the past, while 2026 brings only positivity, confidence, and clear skies above your head. Now, let's talk about the publicly available version of the project, just briefly, so we don't drag the video out. I think it's important to clarify a few things, so there are no questions like what, why, or for what reason. From time to time, small updates are released for the public version of the mod. Why is that done? First and foremost, for testing new features and changes. Versions 1.4.6 and 2.0 share the same script base, and testing certain systems or mechanics in advance is extremely useful. For example, recent patches introduced guides, the ability to take a companion, and rework stashes. Each of these features revealed certain issues that required further polishing. Players who regularly play version 1.4.6 send bug reports, feedback, and suggestions, and based on that information I make the necessary adjustments. What's important is that by the time version 2.0 is released, these features will already be refined and won't cause major issues. That's why I believe the time spent on small updates and fixes was not wasted. In the end, version 2.0 will be far more polished than it could have been otherwise. I'd like to separately thank everyone who plays the public version, shares their impressions, and reports issues. Thanks as well to all content creators who stream the mod or record Let's Plays. Whenever possible, I try to watch these videos. It's very important for me to understand what people like about the project and what they don't. Additionally, such videos often contain interesting ideas that I try to take into consideration. The public version also allows me to test certain technical improvements, for example, optimization. Of course, I'm not claiming that the engine or the mod as a whole runs without any lag or stutters. That's not something the public version can completely get rid of. However, I do constantly work on improving overall performance, and from time to time there are noticeable results. If you compare the project at release with the current downloadable version, the difference is huge, both visually and in terms of performance. For me, it's important not only to improve graphics, but also to make the game comfortable for people who don't have top-tier hardware. You can always crank up the visuals, but what's the point if even powerful PCs struggle to run the game comfortably? Speaking of comfort, let's say a few words about Reshade. It will no longer be included, even in the public version of the project. The reason is quite simple: it's no longer necessary. What does removing it change? The game will start slightly faster, the load on weaker systems should be lower, and most importantly, crashes on certain configurations will be gone. These crashes were rare, but they did happen. On some PCs, the game could crash on launch specifically because of reshade. Removing the reshade library solved the issue, but it still left a bad impression. Imagine a situation where someone doesn't have much free time for games, finally decides to play the mod, and can't launch it because of a crash. They might write to the community for help, but I can't always respond instantly. As a result, wasted time and a ruined mood. In hindsight, reshade should have been removed earlier, but honestly, I just didn't think about it at the time. Alright, let's finish with the public version and move on to something more interesting, development news for version 2. What will be covered in this video? Graphics, locations, sound, gameplay, various fixes, interface improvements, and more. There's quite a lot of information, and initially I planned to release 2 separate videos. But at some point I decided it would be better to release a single, large video toward the end of the year, while also summing up some results. So, in the first part, I'll try to combine 2 topics, graphics and locations, and then we'll move on to various fixes and improvements, since all of these things are closely connected. And we'll start with locations. Yes, even though the core location pack for version 2.0 is already complete, some changes have been made since the last video. In addition, I'll show a few updates that I didn't mention previously. Let's start with something simpler. First on the list is the agroprom location. There were no major or global changes here. I mostly focused on improving what was already in place. Specifically, 2 anomalous formations. First one is a small island and the surrounding area. The original version looked decent as a concept, but the level of detail and overall quality were fairly low and didn't really fit with the rest of the environment. Reworking this asset didn't take much time, but the final result turned out quite well. Next is the winter anomaly on agroprom. This one took a bit more time, mainly because I was searching for a visual style that would fully satisfy me. A boundary effect was added to clearly define the limits of the anomaly, using custom shaders to achieve the desired look in-game. Overall, the level of detail was improved with various small touches. I wouldn't say the result is perfect, but it's noticeably better, and for now that's enough. The only thing left is that some additional particles with the required effects will be added later, after certain engine-related work is completed. Oh, and one more thing, the original level geometry was also significantly improved. Next up is garbage. I won't go over the minor tweaks here, they're not particularly important. However, the anomaly at the vehicle graveyard is definitely worth mentioning. Previously, it was completely static, although plans for a more complex implementation existed from the very beginning. I just didn't get around to it until after the previous development update. I still don't plan to fully explain how this anomaly works, but I can share a few details. For example, the animation speed is not static, it depends on several factors. This, in turn, also affects the behavior of the anomaly itself. By the way, this anomaly has fully functional object collision, so curious players will be able to explore it much more deeply than it might seem at first glance. You might remember that in the previous update video I mentioned that the bar location received some improvements. Well, only after that video did I finally assemble the bar in a playable format, and it turned out that far more changes were made than I originally mentioned. most of the additional improvements were ported from another mod. I can't recall the exact name right now, but I believe the changes came from Death Contrary. Overall, those edits fully covered all my needs for improving the bar, so I didn't add anything beyond that. The only extra work I did during the geometry transfer was removing unnecessary small objects and retexturing probably more than half of the geometry from scratch. In some places, assets from Call of Pripyat were being loaded, in others, the UVs were simply incorrect. And since the resources in version 2.0 differ from those used in that mod, some textures didn't match well at all. In addition, while the new geometry had some object placement, it wasn't enough, so I refined the level dressing in the SDK as needed. I added new objects, replaced all vehicles, and generally brought the location to a consistent visual state. Oh, and one more thing, the original level geometry was also significantly improved. Not the geometry itself, but the texture UVs. And that's still not the end of the changes. In parallel with the main development, Kirill and Maxim are reworking some original assets. As soon as they're ready, I'll replace the objects in the scene and assemble the level in its final form. I want to emphasize this once again, because it's important and, as it turns out, not everyone understands it. The work done by Kirill and Maxim happens in parallel with the main development. This means that locations are still receiving improvements, but this does not slow down progress on the core aspects of the project in any way. Just like with the bar location, improvements to raw stock were also done in parallel with the main development. Kirill and Maxim reworked a very large number of old assets and created many new ones. In total, 694 new objects were added to the location. To better show the scale of this work, I'll display screenshots directly from the editor, showing only the replaced objects. By the way, all railway equipment on the location was also replaced, and vegetation received some minor improvements as well. A new point of interest was added too, and it actually solves several important tasks at once. First, and most obviously, it's a place you can explore and potentially find something interesting. Second, and less obvious, the additional geometry of this anomalous formation should make a certain story moment involving the character Kruglov a bit easier. How exactly? Both the player and the character will have better cover from those who want you dead. And the last location on the list is the swamps. The main changes here affected the pumping station and the surrounding area. Once again, the work was done by Kirill and Maxim. Not all assets were reworked, and that wasn't necessary. But thanks to the work that was done, the level of detail and the overall look of the station turned out absolutely fantastic. However, I need to be honest. Due to certain technical issues and general workload, I didn't manage to assemble the location in a playable format with the latest changes. So here's what we'll do. In this video, I'll show the improvements directly from the editor, and later I'll publish in-game screenshots on the project's platforms as soon as the location is fully assembled. I would really like to see the final result in-game right now, but in that case the development update video would be released later, and there was no guarantee I'd manage to finish it before the end of the year. Either way, the location will be assembled with all changes included. And I want to once again personally thank Kirill and Maxim for all their work. Thanks to you, the locations have become noticeably better, more detailed, more interesting, and with their own unique style. And if we look at the facts, it's actually very hard to find mods for this game with a comparable amount of new assets. You can maybe name 2 or 3 projects, but not many more. So once again, thank you for everything. Since I've already talked about locations, and this topic is closely connected to graphics, let's move on to an improvement that actually started quite a long time ago, but was only fully completed after all locations were assembled in the project. I'm talking about grass. The original goal was to make the vegetation diverse, while at the same time using a single set of resources across all locations. How does it work in the original game? Each location has its own grass file that loads its own set of textures, and those textures are stored inside the location folders. Considering how many textures and models were used during the development of version 2.0, I initially decided to change this approach entirely. In the end, all locations were brought to a unified vegetation style. Every single location now uses the same grass set. What does this change bring in practice? All locations now rely on a single texture atlas that's stored in the shared textures folder instead of being tied to individual levels. In some ways, this significantly simplified the workflow. If I need to make changes, vegetation is updated instantly across all locations. On top of that, this approach slightly reduced the overall size of the mod. Previously, there were 72 textures in 4K resolution, if I remember correctly. Now there are only 5 textures, with a total size of just under 70 megabytes. Yes, with modern storage devices that might not sound like much. But when you reduce the size here, then reduce it somewhere else, in the end you get a noticeable overall size reduction for the project. Since we're already talking about vegetation, let me mention a few more improvements in this area. First of all, I fixed a feature that no one ever reported, and honestly, one I hadn't noticed myself before. Tree trunks now properly sway in the wind, as they should. The wind animation technically existed before, but it worked incorrectly, to the point where you could say it barely existed at all. Next, branches and foliage now have proper normal maps, which I've created for all vegetation textures. This significantly improves the visuals. Leaves no longer look flat. In addition to that, roughness maps for foliage are no longer generated in shaders. Instead, pre-made roughness maps are now used. This also improves the final image, because shader-based generation simply couldn't produce the desired result. Grass, just like tree branches, also received proper normal maps and roughness maps. As a result, the overall image in the game feels more cohesive. The vegetation rendering code across different modes was also updated. This made it possible to fine-tune vegetation color tones more precisely, which further improved the visuals. By the way, version 2.0 introduces an additional vegetation mode, early autumn, or rather, something close to early autumn. In total, version 2.0 will feature 5 vegetation modes to choose from. At the same time, hardware requirements haven't changed at all, which is extremely important. I should also mention one more vegetation-related fix. There was a long-standing bug that sometimes seriously harmed the visuals. In certain places, depending on the camera angle, vegetation appeared darker than it should have been. This issue has now been fixed, and we can finally forget about it. It might seem like I've already said a lot about vegetation and it's time to move on. But there's one more important thing. Version 2.0 will allow players to choose the level of vegetation detail. The quality setting will be available either in the launcher or in the game settings, and it will require a restart. After extensive testing and optimization work, it became clear that the project can afford higher quality assets. However, this would inevitably affect weaker PCs, something I wanted to avoid. I found a solution, and alongside other tasks, I'm gradually improving the vegetation models used in version 2.0. It's important to point out, this work is done without sacrificing other aspects of development. I usually do it when I need a break from core tasks or when I simply need a change of pace. Because of that, the vegetation upgrade process will take some time, but the result will definitely be worth it. Now let's move on to a problem that had been present in version 2.0 for quite a while and absolutely needed to be addressed: lighting. The final image in the project was noticeably darker than it should have been. My goals during this process were the following: make the image brighter where it should be, remove overexposure where it doesn't belong, preserve indoor lighting, so that changes wouldn't affect interiors, fix unwanted color tinting on various materials. While working on this issue, I also made a number of smaller fixes along the way. For example, after switching to the GFY model pack, some additional material maps on NPC models weren't working correctly. One of the problems was that ambient occlusion maps, which I created for all new NPC textures, simply weren't applied. There was also an issue where, at certain camera angles, some materials received an unnatural glare that shouldn't have been there. This problem was visible in development update videos, screenshots, basically everywhere, across all materials. Thanks to several code improvements, this issue has now been completely resolved, and materials in the game are rendered much more correctly. Moving on. The wet surfaces system was significantly reworked. I fixed several problems, added new features, and improved the overall visual quality of wetness effects. First of all, different materials now use different methods to generate the wetness calculation maps. This allowed for much finer tuning of the effect and resulted in better visuals. In addition to the rain impact map, I started using a modified light map-based approach. This made it possible to render wet surfaces in areas where, logically, they should be wet, but previously never were due to limitations of the old calculation method. The final improvement, which had a major visual impact, was changing how lighting highlights and reflections are calculated on wet surfaces. If you look at each of these changes individually, they might not seem very significant, but together, they noticeably improved the wetness effect. The next changes might also seem minor at first glance, but each of them plays a role in shaping the final visual quality of the project. First, sun rays. From time to time, I saw feedback saying they behaved strangely and were only visible when the camera was pointed directly at the sun. I decided to rework this, and now sun rays are always visible. After testing this change, I was sure it should stay. The game became slightly more vibrant because of it. Next, steep parallax mapping was fully restored in the mod. Previously, it had been removed and wasn't used at all, except for terrain textures, and speaking of textures, I paid special attention to them. Why replace textures at all? The old ones raised many questions. Some of them, despite their resolution, were of lower quality than they should have been. Some had poorly made additional maps. In certain places, texture selection was simply off. Considering how many high-quality materials are now publicly available, it would have been a missed opportunity not to update everything that didn't satisfy me personally. In the end, if I'm not happy with the visuals myself, how could others be? There's still a lot of work ahead, but gradually the game's visuals are becoming better and more refined. And now, probably the last graphics-related topic, although it partially affects gameplay as well. Some time ago, in earlier development updates, I announced a new feature, weapon dirt and contamination. At the time, it was only in an early implementation stage, so I temporarily put it aside. As the task list grew, I gradually returned to unfinished features, and now I can say that this system is fully complete. However, it's important to note that for this video, the dirt accumulation speed was intentionally increased to demonstrate the feature more clearly. The same applies to cleaning speed in water. It was significantly boosted for demonstration purposes. In the release version, this will happen much more slowly. The system takes many parameters into account: how the player handles the weapon, what actions are performed with it, and more. It also considers where the weapon falls. If you drop a weapon on the ground and walk over it, or interact with it in certain ways, the dirt level will increase. If you get caught in the rain while carrying a dirty weapon, the dirt will gradually wash off. There will also be special cleaning kits in the game. Alternatively, you'll be able to bring your weapons to a technician and have them cleaned for a small fee. And now a question: will this feature affect gameplay, or will it remain purely visual? In hardcore mode, yes. It will affect gameplay, though not dramatically. In all other modes, it will remain purely visual. Overall, I've covered all the key graphics-related changes. It's important to emphasize that these are improvements made only after the previous development update. I'm mentioning this specifically for those who might feel that not much work was done. However, the visual side of the project isn't fully covered yet. There are 2 more areas that received major updates since the last video and absolutely need to be discussed, and, most importantly, shown in action. I'm talking about the interface and the weapon systems. Since the interface section also affects gameplay, we'll start with weapons first. First of all, let's finally close the topic of the weapon list. After this video, I don't plan to add anything else. Of course, there are certain weapons I would personally love to see in the project, but I simply don't have animations for those models. And more importantly, I don't want to stretch development time by adding content that isn't critically important. As you can see, there is significantly less foreign weaponry in the mod. You can feel however you want about that, but this decision was made back in the early stages of version 2.0's development, and nothing will change in terms of expanding the list toward foreign models. That said, the gameplay definitely won't feel boring, because version 2.0 introduces weapon customization. I've talked about it many times before and shown it in earlier videos, but for new viewers I had to mention it again. And since I brought up customization, let me add an important clarification right away. The game world will not be flooded with endless weapon modules. Some attachments will be rare. Others will be relatively easy to find. Certain modules can be obtained as quest rewards. Customization will not include an infinite number of add-ons, the amount will be fairly moderate, and upgrading weapons will not be mandatory. That covers the core information about weapons, so now let's move on to weapon models, because a lot of work has been done here since the previous development update. Before the showcase, a few words of context. Weapon models were refined as needed. Some were completely replaced, others received various improvements. A lot of time went into texturing. For that, I used Substance Painter, Photoshop, Blender, and Rhizome UV. Of course, I still have room to grow compared to professional artists, but with each new asset I try to improve the final result as much as my skills and free time allow. I'll be honest, starting textures from scratch isn't always the most enjoyable process. But when you see the final result, that's when you really get a boost of motivation. The process itself starts to feel more interesting, and your curiosity grows. For example, it's fascinating to study photos and videos of real weapons, to see how they wear out, why scratches appear more often in certain places, and so on. Then you transfer all of that onto your own model and enjoy the result. Of course, not everything works perfectly on the first try, but in the end you usually manage to achieve what you were aiming for, so why bother reworking weapon textures at all? Many of them already look good, right? And yes, some models are indeed quite decent, and in some cases even very impressive. But that's actually part of the problem. The level of detail across different models varies significantly, and it's very noticeable. The overall visual cohesion is lost, and the project doesn't feel as consistent as it should. That's why from the beginning my goal was to rework as much as possible and bring everything to a unified visual standard. Yes, it takes time. But isn't it worth it? I won't be showcasing every single reworked model, simply to avoid dragging the video out. The models shown here are more than enough to understand the level of quality version 2.0 is aiming for. Let's start with the AK-105. Out of all the AK variants available in version 2.0, this one is probably my favorite now. Previously, one of my subscribers helped with the textures, and at the time the result was more than acceptable. You can actually see this older version in some of the earlier videos. Next up is the RPK. This weapon took much more time than I originally planned. But I'm happy with the result and firmly believe that keeping the old version, which barely resembled an RPK, was not an option. In the end, it wasn't just a simple retexture. I had to find a new model, bind it to the weapon skeleton, adjust tactical attachments, and so on. But thanks to all this work, I can confidently say that I'll genuinely enjoy using this weapon in the game. Now the AEK-971. This might not be my best work, and the visuals could still be improved further. But overall, I'm satisfied with the result. Yes, the model has some inaccuracies that I noticed later, but it's still a massive improvement over what was previously in the project. Special thanks to Kirill for helping with this one. Through joint effort, we managed to bring the visuals to the state you're seeing in these screenshots. In the process, we partially reworked the model, created new UV layouts, made a high-poly version for normal map baking, and then produced the final textures. This model brought a lot of valuable experience and knowledge, and it will also look great in the game. I also added a couple of screenshots of the old model for comparison. The difference in texture quality is quite significant. Next is the Vepr SoC 94 and its attachment variants. I first learned about this weapon back in Servarium, and I really liked it back then. Even in the early stages of development, I planned to add it to the project. At some point, I did, but the visuals were completely unacceptable. I had already tried improving the textures earlier, but that work was limited to Photoshop tweaks and still didn't look right. Now, with a more confident workflow in Substance Painter, I was able to bring the visuals to a state that I'm personally happy with. The result may not be perfect, but with each new model I aim to improve quality and take viewer feedback into account. A few words about the SKS. This version was originally planned as a unique weapon. However, after I posted screenshots in the project's community, someone messaged me and offered to provide the necessary files for a more classic SKS variant. Of course, I didn't refuse, but back to this version, despite the overall quality of the model, some parts still had to be reworked to achieve a result I was fully satisfied with. Next is the VSK 94. The old model didn't receive a complete overhaul, but the changes are still quite noticeable. Certain parts were improved, UVs were reworked, and new textures were created. It may not be perfect, and there's room for further refinement, but within the context of this game, going any further would be unnecessary. As it stands, I'm satisfied with how it looks and can move on. The model itself remains the same, taken from the Gunslinger mod, but it still received several improvements. Overall detail was increased, some parts were fully replaced, and new textures were created. I'm very happy with the final result. Next are the MP5 and the suppressed MP5 SD. The model had been replaced in the project quite some time ago, but the textures were reworked only recently. Overall, I'm satisfied with the outcome. A few words about the SR2M. There's not much to say here, the model is fairly simple, and I handled the texturing process quite quickly. The next weapons, I'll probably just show without any additional commentary. Since we're already talking about models, let me briefly mention mutant models as well. New models for version 2.0 were selected some time ago, and for some of them I even reworked parts of the textures. These models were taken from various compilations and third-party mods, however, they didn't share a unified style and stood out from the rest of the project. So what's changing? Version 2.0 now includes an adapted model pack by Nestandart and Greshnik 13RS. By the way, thank you for your work. Thanks to this pack, a large number of projects now have access to high-quality models, both for mutants and for NPCs. And now we finally get to the interface. In fact, this topic is closely tied to gameplay in the mod, and a bit later you'll clearly see how and why. I'll try to smoothly lead into the gameplay changes, starting with some smaller tweaks. In the previous video, I talked about loading screens and offered two options: in-game screenshots with some post-processing, or AI-generated artwork based on screenshots. Opinions were split almost perfectly in half, and there was no clear winner. So I started looking for a solution, and it came naturally. Initially, I shared a new option on Boosty, and later in the project's group as well. Judging by the comments, everyone was satisfied with it. And now I can say for sure what loading screens in version 2.0 will look like. They were completely rethought to match the new version of the project. At the same time, the entire interface is gradually receiving functional improvements to support the features the mod needs. By the way, it's worth mentioning the overall texture quality of the UI in 2.0. The approach has changed. Now the entire interface is originally created for 1440p resolution, with more detailed textures. What does this give us? If you play at full HD or 1440p, the interface will be sharp, without blurry textures and artifacts. In 4K the quality will drop slightly, but everything will still remain clear and readable, without noticeable blur. And now we move on to more serious changes. First in line is the weapon customization window. Visually, it hasn't changed much. However, the code behind it was significantly reworked and optimized where needed. The first and most noticeable change is how the window appears. Previously, it popped up instantly, without any animation. Now, some elements have movement animations, and the window itself fades in smoothly. Moreover, it now appears much earlier than before. There's no longer a need to wait until the character fully turns the weapon in their hands. In addition, the window now displays extra information about the weapon itself, its stats and condition, which dynamically change depending on installed attachments. This way, the player can immediately see what exactly changed after modifying the weapon. No more guessing whether accuracy improved after installing a foregrip, for example, considering that in version 2.0 weapon stats are also affected by weight. Even removing certain standard parts will already impact how the weapon behaves, and all of this will be reflected in the stats. To help the player understand which modules can be installed, I added a description window. For now, it displays the module's name and description. Later, it will also include detailed information about how it affects the weapon and what dependencies it may have. The description window also appears smoothly and can be hidden when not needed. There's a dedicated hotkey for that. What's important to note is that despite all this additional information, the customization window doesn't feel overloaded. It runs smoothly and provides everything the player needs. For the most part, the customization menu is finished, so we can move on. A few words about the inventory and the overall interface style. Despite all previous improvements, the project still lacked a truly unified visual style, or rather, it wasn't fully there. Now, the inventory has been slightly reworked. There were no major changes compared to the previous version, and there was no need for them, but individual elements were rethought to varying degrees, and I'm very happy with the result. Of course, experienced designers could probably come up with better solutions. I'm not one of them, but I think I've done more than I reasonably could. The main thing is that I achieved the goal I set for myself. Everything else is secondary. Now we move on to a topic that is truly important and affects two aspects of the game at once, the interface and gameplay. Before we begin, I need to explain one thing to give you the full picture. Many of the improvements in version 2.0 were planned from the very beginning. I just didn't talk about them earlier, because my approach has always been to show only what's already done. And now it's time to talk about a gameplay feature that's been planned for a very long time. In hardcore mode, this feature will be enabled permanently. In other difficulty modes, it can be turned off. I understand perfectly well that this kind of mechanic isn't for everyone, so the option to disable it was planned from the start. So, we're talking about the limb damage system and the interface tied to it. First, how it looks. The limb status interface has two display modes, a compact, minimized version on the main HUD, and an expanded version when opening the inventory. The transition between these modes is smooth and has its own animation. In the full mode, the player can see the condition of each limb in percentage values. In both modes, there's also visual indication of critical limb conditions. Players will be able to manually switch the interface into the minimized mode and keep it that way until they decide to expand it again. The limb interface behaves like other HUD elements. It can always be visible, hidden and shown temporarily via a hotkey, or work in an adaptive mode, appearing only when the limb state changes. Now, about how this affects gameplay. I'll say right away, I didn't base this on hardcore shooters or countless stalker mod packs. I don't want to overwhelm the player with overly complex mechanics. Fallout 4 actually came to mind here. It has a similar system, and it doesn't feel complicated or annoying. It can cause some discomfort at times, but nothing more than that. As a result, I came to the following solution. The player can separately damage the left and right arms. The maximum penalty for both arms being damaged is 50%. If only one arm is damaged, the maximum penalty is 25%. The same applies to legs. These values are preliminary and will be balanced later. Depending on difficulty settings, what does this system affect? Arm damage affects reload speed, item usage speed, accuracy, and recoil. Leg damage affects movement speed, jump height, and the ability to sprint. If you have suggestions here, leave them in the comments. I read everything, and the best and most fitting ideas will be implemented. The next thing to decide is how limb damage should be treated in the field. I don't want to make the game significantly harder here. Currently, the idea is this: standard medkits will heal all limbs slightly, higher tier medkits will restore limb condition more effectively. Additionally, there will be a single special item that must be applied to specific limbs for full recovery. If you have ideas, write them in the comments. I'll review all feedback, gather the best suggestions, and based on that, shape the final version of the healing system. Next comes balancing. How mutants damage limbs, with what chance and severity, then anomalies, firearms, fall damage, and so on. The game will become more challenging, but not excessively so, and, more importantly, more interesting. Along with other improvements, it will help the game truly shine. I'll also add an idea regarding artifacts. For at least some of them, those justified by lore, limb damage penalties could be reduced. For example, a Medusa artifact officially increases bullet resistance. That could mean either a lower chance of limb damage from gunfire, or a reduced penalty percentage. One artifact could reduce penalties by 10%, two by 20%, and so on. The same could be done with impact-resistant artifacts. In the original game, they're mostly useless. Here, they could drastically change gameplay. From a technical standpoint, this feature is about 90% complete. There's very little left to finish, and that's exactly what I'll be working on right after this news video is released. With that finished, let's move on to expanding the RPG side of the game. It's no secret that for version 2.0 I made a number of engine-level changes, reworking various mechanics of how the main character interacts with the game world and items. For example, stamina affects movement speed, jump height, item usage speed, reload speed, and so on. These are just the examples that come to mind immediately, considering that this game isn't a pure shooter, and that I was periodically asked about adding or improving certain mechanics. I decided to raise the topic of player progression on Boosty, and honestly, the result surprised even me. In previous news videos, I said that such mechanics weren't planned, and I expected most people to vote against it. But no, on the contrary, many supported the idea and even shared their own suggestions on how it could be implemented. I'll say right away, this system won't be nearly as large-scale as in other games. In the end, I've already implemented passive progression, not for all parameters yet, but still. On top of that, I'll need to think about an interface to properly inform the player about their stats. There will be no perks, only improvements to the base parameters of the main character. It's also possible to introduce one or two new parameters, such as luck, and find meaningful ways to tie them into gameplay. The progression system itself will be passive. What does that mean? The player's stats will improve depending on what they actually do. If you shoot a lot, your character's shooting-related skills improve, and so on. One might ask, why is this needed at all? The game is story-driven, and the playthrough isn't that long. There were also arguments that it's much better when the player improves personally, learning to shoot better, play smarter, and so on. And that's true, it's great when the player develops naturally through gameplay, regardless of stats or numbers. But in that case, only a small part of the player's personal skill set actually improves. And if the player is already experienced, which is true in most cases, since it's hard to find someone who hasn't played this game, then that kind of personal progression doesn't really work at all. In situations like that, passive progression of the character itself becomes noticeable. How strong should it be? That's a matter of balance, tuning values, adjusting parameters, and testing. In addition, version 2.0 will expand existing quests and add new ones. How much larger the story will become is hard to say. I can't really measure that. But considering all the other mechanics and gameplay features, this doesn't feel like something unnecessary or out of place. With that covered, we move on, and this is far from everything. Next up is medicine in the game. But don't worry in advance, I'm not planning to overly complicate things. Maybe just a little. Will the game become more interesting because of it? Absolutely. I thought about this for a long time, whether it was worth doing or not. On one hand, I wanted to make the game more interesting and slightly more challenging, but without going too far. At the same time, I wanted to introduce some additional gameplay options for the main character. That's how the idea came up to rework anti-radiation drugs and introduce new stimulants as separate items with their own capacity, without direct instant use. To actually inject anti-rad or other stimulants, the player will need special injectors that must be refilled manually. The player will manage this process themselves. As a result, treatment and stimulant usage will become slightly more complex, but also more interesting. The most important thing is that this mechanic won't be tedious, unlike weapon magazine loading, which will definitely not be added. Just to be clear, this system allows for some interesting gameplay possibilities. I'll point this out right away: medkits and bandages are untouched. I don't plan to change them at all. That would be unnecessary and wouldn't add anything meaningful. In addition to manually refilling stimulants, players will also be able to buy pre-filled ones. Before heading out, you'll need to prepare in advance, refill or purchase what you need so that you can use stimulants quickly in the field. Players will also be able to find stimulants on other NPCs. Buying is straightforward, no tricks there. But found injectors might be contaminated. And here I'd like to share some ideas from Kirill, which I fully support. The player is warned about this mechanic, so it's clear what might happen. You can choose to use the injector at your own risk, and in about 30% of cases, you'll feel worse. In 5% of cases, you'll need to travel to a trader to get a special antibiotic, slowly losing health along the way. You can sell found injectors of questionable cleanliness for 10% of their value. You can collect them and bring them to Sakharov for batch testing. It'll still be cheaper than buying new ones outright. During testing, the same 30% will simply be discarded. Verified injectors can then be used safely or sold for 50 to 70% of their value. One important clarification: there will be no gradual health drain over time. We settled on a system where various effects appear at set intervals. Dizziness, for example. At first, these effects are barely noticeable, but if the problem is ignored for a long time, negative effects become stronger and occur more frequently. As for stimulant types, this topic is still open and requires further design. However, it's safe to say there will be anti-radiation drugs, an item that helps survive emissions, and an alternative kind of energy booster with limited but effective impact. If you have ideas here, write them in the comments. We can discuss what else could be added and how appropriate it would be. Let's move on to another important topic: stashes. In my opinion, the original stash system in this game was poorly implemented. For those who haven't played or don't remember, here's a quick explanation. By default, all stashes in the game are empty. Their contents only appear after you receive information about them. At the same time, stash locations themselves aren't particularly clever or interesting. You might find a box sitting in plain sight, for example, on an elevator, completely unhidden. The absurd part is that you could check such a box, see that it's empty, then receive information about that very stash while standing nearby, and magically, items would appear inside, even though it was empty just minutes ago. In version 2.0, I wanted to fix this problem and completely rework the system. By the way, the initial version of the new stash system was already added to the publicly available build for testing, bug hunting, and feedback. So, what changes does 2.0 bring? Stashes are now filled from the very start of the game. Their contents are random, but influenced by various factors, such as the location of the stash and even its physical size. Players can loot any stash right from the beginning, but then a question arises. Players are used to stashes being boxes, pipes, and similar objects. In 2.0, stashes can also be hidden in interior objects and vehicles. And on top of that, all stash locations have changed. Yes, completely. There are no old stashes left in 2.0 at all. The solution is simple. Players can still receive stash tips. Once you get information about a stash, it's marked on the map. An interesting detail is that you can even receive a tip for a stash you've already looted. In addition, version 2.0 introduces loot spawn points outside of stashes. To clarify right away, this loot does not respawn. This approach should make the game world feel more filled and, possibly, more alive. Alongside random stashes, there will also be unique ones. However, they won't be tied to specific locations and can appear anywhere. Some of these stashes may include notes left by other stalkers. This already exists in the current version of the mod, but the number of unique stashes is limited, only 15. And stashes with notes are even fewer. The next change in version 2.0 affects both visuals and gameplay. I've wanted to work on this for a long time, but never quite got around to it. Previously, in winter mode, there were no real screen effects, only snowflakes acting like raindrops. It looked strange. Now, winter effects have been completely reworked. Moreover, they no longer depend on snowfall intensity, but on a new parameter, player frostbite. Yes, the game now has a freezing system. It's not in its final form yet and definitely needs further polishing and testing, but even now it already accounts for many factors. For example, the player's overall fatigue, the current outfit, artifacts that may provide warmth, the player's movement state, standing, walking, running, current weather. The system also understands whether the player is indoors or outdoors, which further affects freezing. Standing still makes the character freeze much faster. Walking slowly reduces the freezing rate. Running can actually help the character warm up slightly. For now, aside from artifacts, the only way to warm up is campfires. If you have ideas or suggestions for additional ways to keep the character warm, write them in the comments and we'll discuss them. Now let's talk about the latest changes related to AI behavior. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned that the public version of the project and version 2.0 share the same script base. This is extremely useful, as it allows me to test many new features long before the release of the new version. That's exactly why in version 1.4.6, and even earlier, companion and guide schemes appeared and started working correctly, along with several other behavior schemes. For example, NPCs can now properly change outfits, and various bugs in other behavior schemes have been fixed. Oh, and I almost forgot one important thing. NPCs can now also use shelters during emissions. Previously, they would just stand in place as if nothing was happening. Thanks to this change, the game world has become noticeably more alive. As for the companion system, I published its full description in the Changi log together with the latest patch. The system itself hasn't been heavily modified yet. In the current public version, the player can take only one companion, and here I'd like to hear your opinion, because feedback will directly affect how this system works in 2.0. Should the system be expanded to allow taking more than one companion? From a technical standpoint, this isn't particularly difficult. Most of the time would go into reworking NPC transitions between locations. And yes, I almost forgot to mention this, the original companion system handled location transitions very poorly. Sometimes you had to wait an extremely long time for your companion, and sometimes they would appear in a completely different place, which was clearly visible on the map. This had to be fixed, and fortunately I found a solution fairly quickly. As a result, NPCs now transition together with the player instantly and appear in the exact same spot as the player. Now, about guides. In the public version, the guide system is simply adapted to the project with a few minor fixes. In 2.0, however, this feature will be expanded, primarily in terms of interface. Currently, selecting a destination happens through dialogue options, and that can become a problem due to the reworked locations in the new version. So what's the solution? After selecting the dialogue line "Where could you take me?" a separate window will appear, displaying all available destinations, with icons and short descriptions. This makes it much clearer where the guide can take you and, frankly, looks far better than simple dialogue selection. As always, if you have ideas or suggestions, write them in the comments. We'll discuss them, and the best and most fitting ones will be implemented. All of these systems are not new in general. They were originally created by third-party authors and adapted to the project, with some modifications. But now I want to talk about something that is truly new and created from scratch. Not by me personally, but by a very skilled developer who joined the project and is actively working on several major features. Let's start with something relatively simple, the relationship system. The new relationship system isn't so much a standalone feature as it is a refactoring of existing code, a preparatory step for another system, the witness system. Even so, it allows much more flexible relationship management. You can implement your own script-based handlers, and friendly fire can be enabled via configuration. The entire relationship management code for both NPCs and creatures has also been completely rewritten. Next up, the witness system. this feature allows the player to injure or kill a neutral or friendly NPC without immediate consequences, if required by a quest. It's also useful in firefights when you accidentally hit allies. The core idea is to give the player time to cover their tracks without immediately alerting the entire zone. If no one saw the crime, no one will ever know. If someone did witness it, the player has a choice: eliminate the witnesses, or allow them to report what they saw. If new witnesses appear while dealing with existing ones, the system applies to them in exactly the same way. The player has a limited time window, from discovery to public exposure, and this time depends on the witness's rank, reputation, and personal attitude toward the player. At the moment, what remains is polishing NPC reactions in the form of behavior schemes. For example, XR_wary, alert, scheme, NPC behavior after discovering the corpse of a neutral or friendly character. The NPC stops and looks around, then cautiously approaches the body. Behavior varies by rank. Rookies run up to the body. Experienced NPCs approach carefully. Veterans approach while keeping the area covered. Masters don't approach at all. They kneel and scan the surroundings through their weapon, checking for traps or snipers. After that, the NPC alerts others nearby. Rookies run to the campfire. Experienced NPCs shout. Veterans and masters use the radio. The camp enters an alert. Switching to engine-level combat behavior. If a body is discovered outside a camp, alone, separate logic applies. A similar scheme is also needed for reacting to an actor caught in the act. Yes, this system still needs further work, but it's extremely promising and can significantly change the game for the better. And now, let's move on. I'll briefly mention improvements to NPCs in the game, because this is important. In version 2.0, they won't just be static scenery anymore, and they definitely won't be used only at the very end of the game, as in the public version. At the very least, players will encounter a functional NPC in Cordon, near the military base. Partly because the military will now be far more dangerous, and clearing the base right at the start will no longer be possible. So what's been done? First of all, the endlessly firing, jittery heavy machine gun was reworked. Initial fixes were done via scripts, after which the logic was moved into the engine for better performance. As a result, a turret class was created, allowing burst fire with a configurable number of rounds, a pause after firing a 50-round belt, simulated reload, targeting all living entities, not just the player. The virtual gunner belongs to a faction, and it doesn't have to be military. Dynamic target switching if the current target is eliminated or lost, with a delay before returning the weapon to its idle position. A configurable blind zone. When a target enters it, the turret freezes in its current position and stops firing until the target leaves the zone. Usage with any stationary weapon. For example, an APC hull. This system can be used with mortars, Zu-23 anti-air guns, tank cannons, aircraft cannons, and more. All of this is fully configurable. Work has also begun on adapting the APC-80 model. Additionally, updated burning and explosion effects are planned. APC particle effects will be replaced with higher quality ones. And with that, the news portion of the video is essentially complete. Some minor changes and tweaks weren't mentioned. There's already more than enough information this time around. I also won't pretend that all development time was spent efficiently. Sometimes, time is wasted, trying to solve a problem with no progress, or experimenting with something new only to be dissatisfied with the result. That's completely normal. At the end of the day, I'm not a professional developer with expertise in every field. I'm just a regular person, just like you, the viewers. In some areas I have more experience, in others less. But no matter what, I actively try to improve my skills. And overall, it's clearly visible in the project's development. What's great is that this project allows growth not only as a developer, but also as a person. Back when the very first version of the update was released, it was difficult, sometimes even impossible, to handle criticism, and, let's be honest, a lot of negativity. Now, things are very different. Of course, I'm still just a human. Even now, under certain circumstances, I can sometimes take completely harmless messages the wrong way, often due to fatigue or simple misunderstanding. But one way or another, I continue working on myself. And if I ever offended anyone in the past, know that it was never out of malice. That was just a small digression before the final part of the video. So, we finally reached your questions on the project's platforms. I asked everyone to leave questions that I could answer in this video. However, this time I'll be skipping some of them because I already answered those in the previous news video. I won't drag this out. Let's begin. Will NPC animations be updated or will new ones be added? At the moment, the project uses animations from Call of Pripyat and some third-party animations from various mods. Given the project's current resources, doing anything beyond that is not really possible right now. What about horror elements? Will there be many quests or locations focused on that? Let's put it this way, something might be there. But I don't want to reveal any details. Let it remain a small mystery. Or a surprise for the 2.0 release. Will mutant behavior, attack types, and AI in general be reworked, similar to the controller from Gunslinger? Some new abilities for mutants have already appeared, let's say. However, part of the improvements is still only planned. Will there be immersive item and equipment interactions? Things like putting on and taking off helmets, interference in PDA, holographs, NVGs, and electronics due to emissions, anomalies, radiation, etc. Yes, absolutely. As a simple example, cleaning the helmet visor from dirt and rain. Will NPCs be more immersive with each other? Not just static mannequins standing in one place, like Arnie in the bar, who works as a duty officer 24/7, but actually doing things, interacting, talking to each other. I can't promise this aspect will be implemented on the level everyone might want, but I'll do everything that's within my capabilities. New NPC behavior schemes will help with this to some extent. Will NPC sound balance be adjusted? Footsteps, running, reloading, stance changes, interaction with vegetation, etc., for better audio awareness during combat? Yes, definitely, but after the main work on the project is finished. This is an important aspect, but right now there are more critical tasks. Is there a plan to move to the new 9-ray engine in the future? A transition to another engine with transferring all developments from 2.0 is planned. However, when exactly this will happen and which engine will be used, I can't say yet. Where will weapon modifications come from? Only shops, or can they be found in the world? Partly answered in this video, but I'll repeat, some can be bought. Some can be found, and some modules will be given as quest rewards. Modders often use assets from other mods, locations, weapon packs, models. How do you feel about that, and would you be against others using your materials? This question has already been asked before. My position hasn't changed and won't change. I'll only be glad if developments from both the available version and 2.0 turn out to be useful for other projects. Moreover, if possible, I'd even help adapt certain things if such requests appear. How will the artifact system work? Will artifacts still be almost useless like in Shadow of Chernobyl, closer to Call of Pripyat, or more like in Roadside Picnic, rare, unique, with mechanics instead of stat tweaks? They definitely won't be like in the original game. Maybe not useless, but at least not boring. I don't plan to reveal all mechanics yet, partly because artifact work is temporarily frozen. Artifacts are also tied to detectors, so the scope of required changes is larger than it might seem. What I can say for sure, in 2.0 there will be more unique artifacts, similar to those in the current version, for example, ones that slow down time or increase carry weight. When will it be possible to help with voice acting? It will definitely be needed, and I'll contact everyone personally when I'm ready. I postponed this topic for a long time because I wanted to find people who could help with creating a proper voiceover technical assignment. No offense to those who offered help, but let's be honest, there were many people, and no actual result. So every time I had a choice, pause or abandon main development to deal with voice acting, or look for someone to help close this task. As you can guess, this is something I'll have to handle personally. I'll return to it right after the new year, pushing most other tasks aside to properly prepare the voiceover brief and adjust dialogues if needed. I could have handed the texts over long ago, but I don't think that's the right approach. Each character must convey the right emotions and mood, and that's only possible with a well-thought-out technical assignment. Can NPCs lean, crouch, peek around corners, throw grenades, run, react to emissions? Can the player dual-wield pistols? Information about emissions was already mentioned in the video. Grenade throwing will be added later. As for the rest, it feels like someone wants a bit too much from a simple modification. What about bushes around trees? You can't see or shoot through them, but enemies can. Some improvements in this area are already implemented. I can't promise perfection, but the situation will be better. Will there be content from early builds, like the Ryaboy scene in the bar? Everything related to builds should stay there, or appear in thematic mods. This project is more interested in creating something new. Will there be the ability to climb fences or pull yourself onto higher objects? Plans to adapt a parkour system exist, but it's hard to say when I'll get to it. Will the mod be available on Steam Workshop? Version 2.0, just like the current one, will need to be downloaded and installed manually. I heard the mod has its own soundtrack. Does the composer have a Spotify profile? Yes, links are available in the video description and the pinned comment. Will it run on Steam Deck? As far as I've seen, the current version does run. As for 2.0, I can't say yet. Will there be post-release content support, new quests and such? Yes, if necessary. Will the Liana Arch anomaly be implemented in Pripyat? It has been in the project for quite some time already and was shown in screenshots. What will be required to get into closed beta testing? Will there be an open beta? I've already selected people for CBT but haven't contacted them yet. As for OBT, it's too early to talk about that. After disabling the Brain Scorcher, will we still push toward the CNPP with other stalkers? How difficult will Pripyat be? The story from Radar to the CNPP is completely new. How challenging or interesting it will be, everyone will judge for themselves at the 2.0 release. Will side quests affect the main story? Side quests won't affect the main storyline. Story quests, however, will receive improvements and, in some cases, will be completely new. Will the main character have more vocal reactions? Like in early builds, reacting to hunger, fatigue, injuries. Some reactions will be present, but not in the exaggerated way seen in many mod packs. What if a team offers to buy your engine version after release? Sounds like fantasy, but even hypothetically, no. I have no right to sell someone else's intellectual property. How would you rate your mental health as a mod maker after all this work? Will you take a break after 2.0? It's hard for me to give a percentage. Development tools can be exhausting, but results and progress compensate for that and add motivation. As for a new project, some groundwork already exists, and full development will begin once all major 2.0 tasks are closed. Could you hand over 2.0 support to the team while working on a new project? More likely, we'll start the new project together. What if you lose access to all source files due to force majeure? That scenario is no longer possible. Past negative experience taught me how to properly safeguard everything. Will there be a full release, or a long-term open beta like before? There will be a full release, followed by support if needed. Will freezing mechanics be expanded? Like freezing in snow after drinking too much vodka, custom drinks for warmth. The freezing system is already implemented and was mentioned earlier. As for additional drinks, some ideas are planned. Will there be a spring vegetation pack? No. 5 seasons are more than enough. Will Pripyat include historical references, like photos of firefighters or plant operators? Yes, and not only in Pripyat. What's the current state of the story and quests? I haven't started implementing them yet, for obvious reasons. Development follows a clear plan: locations, graphics, core systems first, then weapons and gameplay features, and only after that, story changes and new quests. How many CBT stages are planned? Currently, 4 testing stages are planned. The number of testers and tests may change. More details will come after the first stage. Will loading screens include tips, like 100 survival tips for the zone? Yes, additional information on loading screens will be present in 2.0. Will medical items and food work gradually, like in Call of Pripyat? Yes, this is planned for 2.0. And with that, we've wrapped up all the development news and your questions. Essentially, I've shared all the important information, showcased the latest progress, and this could be the perfect moment to end the video. But before we finish, I want to take a moment to sincerely thank everyone who supports the project and me personally in any way. Thank you for all your advice, information, criticism, and feedback. Each of you, in one way or another, helps not only to improve the project, but, as I mentioned earlier, also helps me grow as a person in many different directions. I truly appreciate it and am very grateful to all of you. I also want to give special thanks to everyone who works, or has worked, on the project with me. Everyone who has contributed, no matter the size of the contribution, your help has made a difference. I really hope the project won't disappoint those who are genuinely waiting for it. At the very least, I'll do everything I can to make it worth the wait. The new year should be the year when 2.0 finally sees the light and, hopefully, brings only positive experiences. But based on my experience with the first release, I definitely won't rush 2.0. I understand that waiting can be frustrating, but it's far better than releasing a version full of technical issues. So, a special thank you to those who understand this and don't demand a release tomorrow. As they say, to some people, I'd like to wish a bit more positivity in the new year, a little more responsiveness, a bit more restraint. Negativity only breeds negativity. So, let's try to make this world a little kinder in the coming year. For now, that's it from me. I'll see you in the next news video on this channel. Thank you for watching, and Happy New Year!